In the heart of the Dakota Territory, a place carved from blood and sorrow, Elizabeth Monroe was already a ghost. Her life, she believed, was over, buried under the same snow that took her husband a year ago. She was a widow, her hands skilled with a needle and a scalpel, but her heart was a frozen, empty thing. But the wilderness wasn't done with her. And on the third day of a world-ending blizzard, it spat a dying man onto her doorstep. He wasn't a settler. He wasn't a soldier. He was Lakota, the very people her neighbors whispered about in fear. The boogeymen of the plains. To save him was to invite her own ruin. To let him die was to lose the last piece of her soul. She had no idea that this one choice, this single act of mercy in a merciless land, would set in motion a chain of events so impossible, so world-altering, that it would end with a proposition no one in the West had ever dared to imagine. The wind was a beast. It screamed and clawed at the walls of her tiny cabin, a predator hungry for what was inside. For 3 days, the world had vanished into a howling vortex of white. The blizzard of '78 had come with a biblical rage, burying the Wyoming landscape under a suffocating shroud. It was a good day to be inside, a good day to feed the stove, to reread her late husband's medical texts, and to let the howl of the wind drown out the howl of her own loneliness. Elizabeth was 29, but she felt 100. She had the kind of strength that only comes from being shattered and glued back together wrong. Her husband, Dr. Alistair Monroe, had been a good man, a man of science who thought he could heal this raw land. A fever proved him wrong. Now all she had left were his books, his tools, and a homestead 5 miles from anyone. She was checking the seal on the door for the 10th time, a pointless ritual against the cold, when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groan of the house. It was a sound that didn't belong. A low, wet, guttural cough, almost stolen by the gale. Her heart froze in her chest. No one would be out in this. No one sane. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive this past year, screamed at her. Ignore it. Bolt the door. Stoke the fire. Pretend the world is only these 4 walls. But then she heard Alistair's voice, a gentle ghost in her memory. Every life is a lamp, Elsie. You don't just let one go out if you have the means to shield it. With a sigh that turned to fog in the frigid air, she unlatched the heavy wooden bar. The wind ripped the door from her hand, slamming it inward with a deafening crash. Snow and ice blasted into the room, killing one of her lanterns. And there, collapsed against her woodpile, was the source of the sound. He was a man, or what was left of one, and he was Lakota. The fringed buckskin, the long black hair matted with snow and blood, the high cheekbones now skeletal and blue with cold. It was unmistakable. He was the enemy, the savage her neighbors used to scare their children. And he was bleeding out on her doorstep, a growing crimson stain on the pure white snow. A crude bandage on his thigh was soaked through with blood. A broken arrow shaft jutted from his shoulder, snapped off close to the skin. For a long moment she just stared, her mind a whirlpool of fear and duty. To help him was suicide. If he was found here, she'd be branded a traitor, an outcast. Her nearest neighbor, Cormac Riley, a man whose hatred for the Lakota was as wide as the plains, would probably lead the mob to her door himself. But to leave him there, to watch the life freeze out of him just feet from her warm fire, that was a different kind of hell. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were black pits of dazed animal pain. He tried to push himself up, his hand fumbling for a knife at his belt, but the effort ended in a ragged groan. He collapsed back into the snow, his breath a weak puff of steam. Alistair's voice again, calm and steady. Check the bleeding first, Elsie. Pressure. Always apply pressure. The decision was made before she even knew it. Her body moved, fueled by a year of sleeping purpose. She grabbed the man under his arms. He was lighter than he looked, all sinew and bone, and dragged him inside. The effort stole her breath, made her muscles scream. She kicked the door shut against the storm and threw the bar, plunging the room into the dim, flickering light of a single lantern. He was unconscious now. Laying him on the bearskin rug before the stove, she saw the full horror of his injuries. The leg wound was a vicious gash, long and deep. But it was the arrow in his shoulder that was the real killer. It was lodged deep in the muscle, terrifyingly close to the great arteries of his neck and chest. Her hands, which had trembled with fear moments before, were now steady as rock. She wasn't Elizabeth Monroe, the grieving widow, anymore. She was Dr. Monroe's assistant, his student, his legacy. She fetched the medical chest. Inside, scalpels and forceps lay nestled in velvet, all meticulously clean. She stoked the fire until it roared, setting a kettle of water on to boil. She tore strips from her last good linen sheet. The man's breathing was a shallow whisper. His skin was hot with fever, a raging fire under the ice. Sepsis, blood poisoning. If she didn't act fast, the infection would kill him long before the blizzard broke. First, the arrow. She cut away the stiff, blood-soaked buckskin. The skin around the entry point was swollen and an angry purple. Probing gently with her fingers, she could feel the arrowhead, a wicked piece of sharpened flint, lodged tight against bone. It wouldn't pull out. The barbs would shred him from the inside. It had to be pushed through. She took a long, deep breath, whispering a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. "Forgive me," she murmured. She poured whiskey from Alistair's flask onto the wound and her scalpel. The man's body arched in a silent scream, but he didn't wake. Gripping the scalpel, she made a swift, deep cut on the other side of his shoulder, where the tip of the arrowhead bulged under the skin. Dark, sluggish blood oozed out. Then came the worst part. Taking the broken shaft in one hand and placing a block of wood under his shoulder for leverage, she pushed. There was a sickening grate of stone on bone, a stretching of muscle and sinew. Sweat beaded on her forehead. For a terrifying second, it wouldn't budge. She repositioned her grip and pushed again, putting her entire body weight into it. With a wet, sucking pop, the flint arrowhead broke through the new cut. She nearly fainted with relief. Using forceps, she drew the bloody arrowhead the rest of the way out, dropping it into a metal basin with a clatter. The shaft followed. Now she had two gaping wounds to deal with. She worked like a machine, cleaning them with boiled water and carbolic soap, her movements precise, just as Alistair had taught her. She stitched the wounds shut with a surgeon's needle, her stitches small and neat. Next, the leg. The gash was filthy, packed with dirt and pine needles. It took her the better part of an hour to debride it, cutting away the dead tissue until she was down to healthy bleeding flesh. She stitched this wound too, then bound his shoulder and thigh with clean linen bandages. She stripped him of his remaining wet clothes with a clinical detachment that surprised her. His body was a road map of old scars, a testament to a life of brutal hardship. He was lean but powerful, his skin the color of polished copper in the firelight. She covered him with a heavy wool blanket. Exhausted, she collapsed into a chair. The bloody instruments and rags littered the floor around her. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was a new and terrifying silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the stranger's labored breathing. She had done it. She had saved him. She had invited the wolf into her den. And as she looked at his face, peaceful now in a feverish sleep, she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the blizzard outside was the least of the storm she would have to face. The blizzard broke on the fifth day, leaving behind a world of blinding white and deafening silence. The Lakota scout, who she thought of only as the patient, drifted in a sea of fever. For days, Elizabeth's world shrank to the small space between her stove and the bearskin rug where he lay. She spooned broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She changed his dressings. She listened to the guttural, fever-fueled words he spoke in a language she didn't understand. The tone, however, was universal. Pain, memory, loss. His fever finally broke a week after he arrived. She was dozing in her chair when a sound snapped her awake. His eyes were open. They weren't glazed with fever anymore. They were clear, dark, and intensely alert. And they were watching her. A cold, sharp spike of fear shot through her. The patient was gone. In his place was a warrior. His eyes scanned the room, assessing his surroundings, missing nothing. He tried to sit up, his hand instinctively flying to his hip where his knife should have been. Finding it gone, his eyes narrowed, locking onto hers with a flash of pure, cold suspicion. Elizabeth held up her hands, palms open, a gesture she prayed was universal for peace. She pointed to the bandages on his shoulder and leg, then to the medical chest on the floor. "I helped you," she said softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words. "You were hurt, in the storm." He didn't relax, but a flicker of understanding crossed his face. His gaze dropped to the neat stitches on his shoulder, then to the clean bandage on his thigh. He touched the area around the wound gingerly, his expression impossible to read. He looked around her small, tidy cabin. At the bookshelf filled with Alistair's volumes, the neatly stacked firewood, the rocking chair with her mending basket beside it. This was the home of a white person, an enemy. And yet, it was where he had woken up alive. Their communication over the next few weeks was a careful, silent ballet. She learned he was fastidious, insisting on cleaning himself as soon as he was able, despite the agony it caused him. He was a watcher, his eyes tracking her every move, learning her routines. He learned the English words for water, fire, food. She learned the Lakota word for thank you, Pilamaya. He said it once, his voice raspy, after she served him a bowl of venison stew. That single word felt as monumental as a signed peace treaty. She decided to call him Wombly, the Lakota word for eagle, which she found in one of Alistair's ethnography books. He seemed to accept it, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod when she first used it. He, in turn, never named her. He referred to her only with a slight inclination of his head, a gesture that was both respectful and distant. The intimacy of their situation was a constant, unspoken charge in the air. She was acutely aware of him, of his quietness that wasn't empty, but a deep, listening stillness. He moved with a fluid grace, even when injured, a world away from the heavy-booted men she was used to. He would watch her hands as she kneaded dough or stitched a patch, a focused intensity in his gaze that was unnerving and, to her shame, strangely flattering. One afternoon, as she was cleaning Alistair's old rifle, Wombly gestured toward it. He took the weapon from her, his touch surprisingly gentle. He sighted down the barrel, checked the action, and handed it back with a nod of approval. Then he picked up a small stone from the hearth, and with a series of quick, precise movements, mimed drawing a bow and loosing an arrow, he pointed to himself. "Hunter." Then he pointed to the rifle. "Hunter." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Elizabeth understood. She pointed to herself and shook her head. She made a motion of listening with a stethoscope, of mixing herbs, of stitching a wound. She pointed to the medical books. "Doctor," she said. Then she pointed to the small, framed photograph of her and Alistair on the mantelpiece. "My husband." She traced a finger over Alistair's smiling face, then drew her hand across her own heart and let it fall. The gesture for gone. Wombly was silent for a long time, his gaze resting on the photograph. He looked at her, then at the tools of healing scattered around the cabin, and a new understanding seemed to settle in his eyes. The distance between them shrank, replaced by a quiet, shared respect for the ghosts they both carried. But the greatest threat lay beyond the cabin walls. One morning, a sharp rap on the door sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Wombly, who had been carving a piece of firewood with a small knife she had given him, went utterly still. His eyes became predator-sharp, his body tensed like a coiled spring. "Mrs. Monroe, you in there?" It was Cormac Riley. His voice was thick with false concern that didn't hide the suspicion beneath. Elizabeth put a finger to her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. Wombly slid from his chair to the floor, moving with silent speed into the small curtained-off alcove where her bed was. In a blink, he was gone, invisible. "Just a moment, Mr. Riley," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door. Cormac Riley stood there, a large, florid man with a thick red beard and pale, suspicious eyes. He held a burlap sack, a neighborly gesture that was anything but. His gaze swept past her, scrutinizing every inch of her cabin. "Heard you were holed up tight during the storm," he said, his eyes lingering on the bearskin rug. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right. A woman alone." He let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. "I'm quite fine, thank you," Elizabeth said, forcing a smile. She stood firmly in the doorway, blocking his entry. "The cabin is sturdy." "Saw some tracks a few days back, after the melt," Riley said, his tone casual, but his eyes were chips of ice. "Moccasin prints, heading this way. Thought maybe you had some trouble." He was fishing, baiting her. "The wind plays tricks with the snow, Mr. Riley," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic drumbeat in her chest. "I've seen nothing." His eyes narrowed. He sniffed the air. "Smells different. You burning something new?" Sage. Wombly had burned a small bundle of sage a few nights before, a cleansing ritual she hadn't understood but had allowed. The faint, sweet smell still clung to the air. "Just some herbs for a chest cold," she lied smoothly. "My husband left behind many such remedies." Riley grunted, unconvinced. He thrust the sack at her. "Well, you keep that rifle of the docks loaded. The Cheyenne are restless, and the Lakota, well, you know, an arrow finds a white woman's back just as easy as a man's." The veiled threat was crystal clear. He was warning her, reminding her of her place, of the dangers he believed he was protecting her from. After he finally left, his heavy boots crunching in the snow, Elizabeth leaned against the closed door, her legs weak with relief. Wombly emerged from the alcove, his face a grim mask. He had heard everything. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not just respect in his eyes, but a shared sense of peril. They were no longer just a healer and a patient. They were allies, bound together by a dangerous secret, trapped by the long, unforgiving winter. And spring, she realized with a fresh wave of dread, was still months away. January bled into February, and the fierce grip of winter began to weaken. The sun held a hint of warmth at midday. The relentless wind sometimes softened to a whisper. Inside the cabin, the thaw was more profound. The air that had once crackled with tension now held a quiet domesticity that was both comforting and incredibly dangerous. Wombly was almost healed. The wound on his shoulder was a puckered red scar, and he'd regained most of the strength in his leg. He had taken to helping her with the daily chores, his silence a companionable presence. He chopped wood with an easy, powerful rhythm. He learned to work the water pump, to mend a broken fence post, to track rabbits for their stew with snares of his own ingenious design. He was a man of immense skill. He showed her how to read the clouds for a coming storm, how to find the North Star, how one plant could be used for dye and its neighbor for a poultice. In return, she taught him more English. He learned to read simple words from a child's primer she'd kept. Sun, moon, house. He would trace the letters with a calloused finger, his brow furrowed in concentration, his deep voice carefully shaping the foreign sounds. One evening, by the firelight, he took a piece of charcoal and began to draw on a smoothed plank of wood. He drew mountains and rivers, a winding trail, a circle of teepees, his home. Then he drew a stick figure of himself on a horse, with other figures on horseback nearby. A buffalo, a hunting party. Then he drew his horse stumbling, a rock, himself falling. And then he sketched the arrow, not in flight from an enemy's bow, but on the ground, something he had fallen upon in the chaos of the stampede. The truth hit Elizabeth with stunning clarity. He wasn't a warrior fleeing a battle. He was a hunter, separated from his party by a simple, brutal accident. The entire story her neighbors and the soldiers would have assumed, a violent clash, a righteous pursuit, was a complete lie. The reality was quieter, more mundane, and somehow more tragic. He was just a man who had suffered a terrible misfortune, miles from his people, in the heart of what they considered enemy territory. This new knowledge shifted the ground beneath her feet. Her act of mercy hadn't been for an enemy combatant, but for an ordinary man in need. But she knew that to Cormac Riley and the rest of the world, that distinction meant nothing. A Lakota was a Lakota. End of story. Riley's visits became more frequent. He never came with a direct accusation, just with prying questions and a simmering, watchful presence. He'd bring a string of fish or a cut of venison, excuses to peer into her cabin, to search for any sign of the moccasin tracks he was so obsessed with. "Heard tell from a patrol out of Fort Laramie," he said one afternoon, leaning against her door frame. "They've been finding Lakota sign all over these hills. War party, they reckon. Looking for trouble." He paused, his eyes flicking to hers, sharp and knowing. Or maybe looking for someone they lost. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She kept her expression placid, her hands busy mending a shirt. "I'm sure the Army can handle it, Mr. Riley." "The Army ain't always around when you need 'em," he grunted. "A person's got to be able to handle their own troubles, or get rid of them." The day she knew things had come to a head was when she found one of her rabbit snares disturbed. It wasn't the work of a coyote. The tripwire had been deliberately cut, the bait removed. It was a message, a sign that someone had been on her property, watching. That night she spoke to Wombly, her voice low and urgent. "They know," she whispered, her back to the door as she stared out into the pitch-black night. "He knows, Riley. He is watching." Wombly came to stand beside her. He looked out into the darkness, his senses seeming to pierce the black veil. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, firm gesture of reassurance. "I know." He picked up the charcoal plank. He drew his camp again. Then he drew the sun low on the horizon. Then a full moon. He pointed to the moon. Then he pointed to himself and drew a line leading away from her cabin, back towards the mountains. He would leave at the next full moon, when the nights were brightest and the last of the deep snows had melted from the high passes. It was 2 weeks away. The knowledge landed in her heart like a stone. She had grown used to his presence, to the shared silence, to the simple fact of not being alone. The thought of this cabin returning to its hollow emptiness was an ache she hadn't anticipated. She was saving his life. But he, in his quiet way, had been saving hers from a different kind of death. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. A week before the full moon. Wombly was out checking a new line of snares he had set deep in the woods behind the cabin. Elizabeth was churning butter when the door burst open without a knock. Cormac Riley stood there, his face twisted in a mask of triumphant rage. In his hand, he held a single beaded moccasin. "I found this by the creek," he snarled, throwing it onto the floor. "Don't you lie to me again, Mrs. Monroe. Don't you dare lie to me. You've had one of them in here all winter, haven't you?" Elizabeth stood frozen, the butter churn handle slipping from her grasp. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a denial, but her face must have betrayed her. "You filthy squaw lover!" he spat, his voice thick with venom. "Feeding him, warming him, while his kind were butchering my wife and boy." He took a step into the room, his eyes wild. "Where is he? Hiding under your bed like a coward." "Get out of my house, Mr. Riley," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking but laced with steel. "I'll get out when I've dragged his carcass out with me," he sneered, his hand moving to the large pistol holstered at his hip. "I'm the law out here when the sheriff's too yellow to act. I'm going to search this place, and when I find him—" Suddenly the back door, the one leading from the small storage room, creaked open. Wombly stood there. He wasn't holding a weapon. His hands were empty, his face calm. But his presence filled the room, radiating a power that made Riley take an involuntary step back. Riley recovered quickly, his face breaking into a cruel grin. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing like a gunshot in the small space. "Well, well," he breathed, his eyes gleaming with hatred. "Look what the cat dragged in. I knew it. On your knees, savage. I'm going to enjoy this." Wombly did not move. His eyes were fixed on Riley, but it was not a look of fear. It was a look of profound, almost pitying contempt. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I said, on your knees!" Riley screamed, his voice cracking. Before he could fire, before Elizabeth could even scream, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. "Put the weapon down, Cormac." Sheriff Brody stood in the open front doorway, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies were behind him, their expressions grim. Riley stared, dumbfounded. "Sheriff, what are you doing here? This is my business. He's a Lakota." "I got a telegraph 2 days ago," Sheriff Brody said, his eyes never leaving Riley. "From Fort Laramie. The Lakota sent a runner under a peace flag. They're not on the warpath, Cormac. They're looking for a lost hunter." The sheriff's gaze flickered to Wombly, then to Elizabeth. "A man named Wombly, the son of their chief, Matau Sapa. Seems he had an accident during a buffalo run back in the fall. They said he was last seen heading into a great storm in this direction. They were afraid he was dead." Riley's face went slack, his triumphant rage collapsing into utter confusion. The story that had fueled his hatred, the justification for his violence, was falling apart before his very eyes. "Now I'll say it one more time," the sheriff said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Put the gun down." Riley, his eyes wide and vacant, slowly lowered the pistol. The immediate threat was over. But Elizabeth knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The secret was out, and the whispers on the wind were about to become a roar. The days after the confrontation were thick, with a tense, oppressive silence. Sheriff Brody had escorted a sullen Cormac Riley back to Redemption Creek, leaving Elizabeth and Wombly in a strange state of limbo. The secret was no longer theirs. It belonged to the law, and by extension, to the entire territory. Elizabeth felt naked, as if the walls of her cabin had been stripped away, leaving her vulnerable to the judgment of a world that would never, ever understand. Wombly was due to leave. The full moon, the celestial appointment he had made with himself, was only a few nights away. They both knew it. The knowledge sat between them, a heavy, unspoken truth. He spent his days preparing. He repaired the moccasin Riley had thrown to the floor, his stitches as neat as her own. He fashioned a new bow from a seasoned piece of ashwood. He was transforming back into the man he was before the storm, shedding the skin of the patient. Elizabeth watched him, a hollow ache growing in her chest. The silence that had once been companionable now felt like a countdown. What would she say when he left? A simple goodbye. How could such a small word possibly contain the weight of the entire winter they had shared? He had saved her from a crushing loneliness. She had saved him from a frozen death. Their lives were interwoven now, in a way that transcended language and culture. Yet they had no words for it. On the morning of his departure, the air was crisp and clear. It was the smell of spring, of endings and beginnings. He stood by the door, dressed in the buckskin she had painstakingly mended. He carried the new bow and a small pack. He looked like he belonged to the mountains, to the vast open spaces beyond her small patch of cleared land. He turned to her. His dark eyes held a depth of emotion she had never seen before. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently graze the wood of the doorframe beside her head. A farewell to the cabin itself. "Elizabeth," he said. Her name. He had never spoken it before. The sound of it in his deep, quiet voice was both a shock and a strange comfort. "Wombly," she replied, her own voice thick. He said something then, a short phrase in his own language, the words musical and soft. Seeing her confusion, he used the simple English he had learned. "You have—" He searched for the words. "A strong heart, a good heart." He touched his own chest. "My people will know of you." And then he was gone. He walked away without looking back, his figure growing smaller and smaller against the rolling foothills until the landscape swallowed him completely. Elizabeth stood in the doorway for a long time, the empty space he left behind a physical presence in the room. The silence that rushed in was absolute, profound. She was alone again. 2 weeks passed. Life fell into a new hollow rhythm. She tended her garden, mended her clothes, but the purpose was gone. The nights were the worst. The cabin felt too large, too quiet. Cormac Riley was gone. Sheriff Brody told her he'd sold his ranch for a pittance and headed for Oregon. "Some men can't live without their hate," the sheriff had said. "When you took that away from him, you took everything." Elizabeth felt no triumph, only a weary sadness. Her isolation was now absolute. When she made her monthly trip to Redemption Creek for supplies, the whispers followed her like a shadow. Faces turned away. The store owner who once greeted her with a smile now counted her change in stony silence. She was the Lakota lover, the woman who had harbored a savage. She had crossed a line, and in the rigid, fearful society of the frontier, there was no coming back. She was considering selling the homestead, moving back east where she could be anonymous, when she saw the riders. They appeared on the horizon at dawn, not a war party, but a slow, deliberate procession. A dozen of them, sitting tall on their ponies, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. They carried no rifles, only lances adorned with eagle feathers that fluttered in the morning breeze. Fear, a familiar old friend, clenched her stomach. She ran inside, her hand going to Alistair's rifle. She barred the door and watched through the window as they approached. They stopped a respectful distance from the cabin and dismounted in unison. One man walked forward alone. He was older, his face a noble mask of weathered lines, his long hair streaked with gray. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, and beside him, walking with the same proud bearing, was Wombly. Elizabeth's heart stopped. He looked different. He was dressed in ornate beaded leggings and a shirt that bespoke high status. He looked stronger, more confident. He was home. The older man stopped and raised a hand, palm open. Wombly stepped forward. "Elizabeth," he called out, "do not be afraid. This is my father, Matau Sapa. We come in peace." Her hands trembling, she unbarred the door and stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. She stood on her small porch, a lone woman facing a delegation of Lakota chiefs. Matau Sapa spoke, his voice a low, powerful rumble. Wombly translated, his English careful and formal. "My father says the spirits are good to us this day," Wombly began. "He says that for many moons our hearts were on the ground. His only son was lost to us. We thought the winter spirits had claimed him." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I told them of the woman with the strong heart, the white doctor's widow who fought the fever spirit for me, who pulled the stone tooth from my shoulder, and who hid me from the man with hate in his eyes. I told them you gave me back my life." Matau Sapa spoke again, a long, solemn speech, gesturing to her cabin, to the mountains, to the sky. "My father says that such a debt cannot be paid with horses or hides," Wombly translated, his voice dropping slightly. "He says an act of such courage, an honor so great, must be met with an honor to match it. He says a woman with a spirit so strong should not be left alone in a hostile land. His people would offer you protection, a place in our lodges, a home among us." Elizabeth stared, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was being said. This was more than thanks. This was an offer of kinship, an alliance. Then came the final, stunning part of the translation. Wombly looked away from her, towards the horizon, as he spoke the words. "To bind our peoples, and to honor you as you deserve," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father, Chief Matau Sapa, asks if you will accept me, his son, as your husband." The proposal hung in the still morning air, as shocking and surreal as the blizzard that had started it all. It was not a question of love or romance. It was a treaty offered between two worlds, presented in the form of a life. An offer of marriage, not just to a man, but to a people, a future she could never have imagined. She looked from the solemn face of the great chief to the man she had saved, the man who had, in turn, saved her. Her world had shrunk to this homestead and the scorn of her neighbors. Now, a new, impossibly vast world was being laid at her feet. The choice was hers. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The solid earth beneath her worn leather boots suddenly felt precarious and strange. A marriage offer. It was so far beyond the realm of possibility that for a moment she wondered if she had fallen into a dream, a grief-stricken madness. She looked at the men before her. Their faces were impassive, carved from stone and patience. Their dark eyes watched her, waiting. They weren't seeking an answer born of passion. This was a negotiation of states, a treaty offered to a party of one. They were offering her a kingdom in exchange for her exile. They were offering her a people. Her gaze shifted to Matau Sapa. The chief's eyes weren't hard. They held a piercing wisdom. He looked at her not as a prize, but as a sovereign entity whose power he acknowledged. He had seen her strength not in wielding a weapon, but in mending a wound in a world that only valued killing. He was honoring her for healing. It was a philosophy so contrary to everything she had ever known, it staggered her. Then she looked at Wombly. He stood beside his father, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, as if he couldn't bear to watch her face as she processed the impossible choice. In his averted eyes, she saw the truth. This was his duty, an obligation born from the life she had saved. But was that all it was? She remembered the quiet evenings by the fire, the shared labor, the moment he had spoken her name for the first time. There was a thread between them, woven in silence and shared peril, and it was stronger than mere obligation. It was a bond of profound mutual respect. Perhaps in his world that was a sturdier foundation for a life together than the fleeting passions she had seen crumble around her. Her mind was a torrent of panic and wonder. What was she holding on to here? A cabin filled with ghosts. A garden she tended out of habit, not joy. The scorn of Redemption Creek. The whispers that followed her like flies. She was a pariah, branded for an act of compassion. The world she had belonged to had already thrown her out into the cold. She had just been too stubborn to let go. Cormac Riley, in his blind hatred, had ironically set her free. He had shown her there was no place for her here anymore. To refuse this offer was to choose a slow, lonely decay, a living death. To accept, that was the terrifying part. To step out of her world and into his would be like stepping off a cliff in the faith that you might learn to fly on the way down. She would be an outsider there too, a pale face in a sea of copper. She didn't know their language, their customs, their gods. She would be as helpless as a child. But she would not be alone. The choice crystallized, not as a thought, but as a deep, resonant certainty in her soul. It wasn't about choosing between two men, Alistair and Wombly. Alistair was a memory, a cherished part of the woman she had been. Wombly was a future, a frightening and beautiful possibility for the woman she was becoming. She did not speak. Words were inadequate. Instead, she turned and walked back into her cabin. The Lakota remained motionless, watching. Inside, the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs filled her lungs. Her eyes swept over the small room that had been her entire world. The rocking chair, the mantelpiece with the photograph, the bookshelf. It was all a monument to a life that was over. She knelt and opened Alistair's medical chest. Its contents gleamed in the shaft of morning light. The polished steel of the forceps, the glint of the glass vials, the neat rolls of linen bandages. This was her identity. This was her strength, her purpose, her worth. It was the legacy of her first husband, the very skill that had brought her to this unbelievable crossroads. She closed the heavy lid, the click echoing in the quiet room. She took one last look at the photograph of Alistair, his kind, smiling face frozen in time. She whispered a single silent goodbye. Then, lifting the heavy leather bag, she walked back out onto the porch. She walked down the 2 steps and across the yard, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She did not stop until she stood directly before Matau Sapa. He was taller than she was, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. With a steady hand, she held out the medical bag. Matau Sapa looked at the bag, then at her face. He understood. This was her dowry. This was her acceptance speech. This was her oath. She was not coming empty-handed. She was bringing her medicine, her knowledge, her power. A slow, deep smile spread across the chief's weathered face. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. He did not take the bag from her. Instead, he motioned to his son. Wombly stepped forward, his eyes finally meeting hers. The relief in them was a palpable wave. He took the medical bag from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, electric, a spark of promise. He spoke a single word to her in Lakota, a word she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in his gaze. "Welcome." One of the warriors led a gentle, spotted pony forward. It had no saddle, only a thick blanket. Wombly gestured for her to mount. For a moment she hesitated, the reality of the moment crashing down. She was leaving everything. She turned and took one last look at the sod-walled cabin. It looked small and fragile now, a temporary shelter she had mistaken for a home. With a deep breath, she turned her back on it for the last time. Wombly gave her a hand up onto the pony, his grip strong and sure. The journey began. They rode east, towards the sacred Paha Sapa, the black hills that rose like a fortress from the plains. Elizabeth rode between Wombly and his father, a position of honor and protection. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on the turf, and the sigh of the wind through the new spring grass. The land that had once been her prison was now a path to freedom. They rode for 2 days. In the evenings, they made a simple camp. She shared their food and listened to the low, musical cadence of their language around the fire. She was an island of silence in a sea of sound, yet she didn't feel excluded. Wombly stayed close, a silent guardian, his presence a constant reassurance. Late on the afternoon of the second day, they crested a rise, and Wombly pointed. Below them, nestled in a valley carved by a winding river, was the camp. It was a sprawling collection of painted teepees, smoke curling from their peaks into the clear blue sky. The sounds of the village, the barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the rhythmic beat of a distant drum, rose to meet them. It was teeming with life, a stark contrast to her years of solitude. It was beautiful and terrifying. As they rode down into the valley, people emerged from their lodges to watch. Faces turned towards her, filled with curiosity, awe, and suspicion. She was the white woman from the stories, the healer who had saved the chief's son. A ghost story made flesh. They stopped in the center of the camp, where a large ceremonial fire was being prepared. The entire village seemed to gather, forming a great circle. Matao Sapa dismounted and raised his hands for silence. He began to speak, his voice ringing with authority. He told the story of the great storm, of his lost son, of the woman who had faced down fear and prejudice to save him. He spoke of her courage, of the honor she had shown their people. Then he turned and beckoned for her to come forward. Trembling slightly, Elizabeth slid from her pony and went to stand beside him, with Wombly on her other side. "The spirits have given this woman a strong heart and healing hands," Wombly translated for her as his father spoke. "She no longer has a people, so we will be her people. She no longer has a home, so our lodges will be her home. She will no longer be known by her white name, a name that carries the sorrow of her past. From this day forward, she will be known to us as Winona Waste." He paused and looked at her. "It means good woman," he explained softly. Matao Sapa then took Wombly's hand and her hand and held them up together for all to see. A great cheer went up from the crowd, a wave of sound that washed over Elizabeth, not with hostility, but with welcome. Winona Waste, a new name, a new life. Standing there, her hand in Wombly's, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, she looked out at the faces of her new people. She did not know what the future held, what trials awaited her. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid. She was home. Elizabeth stood on the precipice of two lives. Behind her lay the lonely ghost of a past she understood, a world of fences, scripture, and suspicion that was now casting her out. Before her stood a future as vast and unknown as the plains themselves, a life of motion, of different gods and different laws, offered by a man whose language she barely spoke, but whose heart she knew. Her yes would not be a romantic whisper, but a declaration of war on the world she was leaving behind. It was the most terrifying and the most liberating choice a person could make. What is true courage? Is it facing the dangers you know, or embracing a future you can't possibly predict? Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery don't happen on a battlefield, but in the quiet, desperate chambers of the human heart. If this story of unexpected bonds and impossible choices moved you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who loves tales of the true West, and subscribe for more stories that dig beneath the dust of history. What would you have chosen in Elizabeth's place? Let us know in the comments below.